so I'm here to talk to you guys about Rails development tools. So you guys, I'm assuming a bunch of you guys have been through the Rails for Zombies classes. Can you guys raise your hands if you have? Okay, that's cool. And the other succeeding courses with Michael Hartle, have you guys attended that a little bit? All right, so who here has used an IDE to develop ever? Oh, that's exactly what I wanted, so that's beautiful. Who here has been using command line tools and fancy stuff? Oh, well, you guys too, all right, that's cool. So Rails is an ecosystem, and this is what I want to talk about today. I'm just introduce myself really quickly before that. Let's see if that clicker works, assuming it doesn't. My name is Olivier. It's really hard to pronounce, so here's a little guideline. You want to say yay at the end. It makes you happy. It makes me happy. Everybody's happy. I come from Paris, and I've moved to Orlando. I know, that's weird. I work on a little thing called Code School. So if you went through Rails for Zombies, you've seen something I worked on. Day to day, I try to make things for Code TV to help people get accustomed to Rails, for instance, with the tools that they've never used ever. So we try to make videos for them to get started after they've learned the basics of Rails. So that's something we really want to foster. There's something in the air right now. This notion that the good old days of Rails were so much better, and that now it's gotten all complex and scary, and that you guys should be terrified because now it's hard. Before it was perfect. I don't believe that. I think that's a load of bull. And basically, the problem here is that we had something simple at the beginning, and now we have something refined. So we have a small ecosystem, which you can know really quickly, and now we have a big ecosystem with a lot of really cool tools, but you can't know them all at once, and it's really hard to grasp all of them at a glance. So this is why this talk was conceived. Like I said, small and powerful tools. One of the things that I want you to feel comfortable about is that, first of all, these tools are nice, but some of them involve this thing, the command line. So we're going to go there, and if a bunch of you guys have used the command line, so you'll be fine, and you won't be terrified. Don't be terrified of the command line. It's just text. It's just typing text and simple tools that are actually way easier than some of the IDEs that you guys have used. And so what we're going to look at is a set of tools that you want to have on your tool belt to start developing Rails applications and feel less, like a fish out of water. The first thing that you guys should look at, if you haven't already, is Homebrew. That's a basis for building any kind of binary from source. So a bunch of utilities like MySQL, Postgres, a bunch of tools that you're going to use with, for instance, using a database for an application. And the only thing that is kind of weird about Homebrew is this installation line over here. That's kind of scary. Basically what this is doing is calling a remote server and installing a script from a remote server. That is bad. That is really bad. So don't do that all the time. Make sure you know the guys doing that. Just saying. The advantage after you install Homebrew is that you get things like this. You can type brew search whatever, in this case POW, and you get a little text that says POW. After that, you can do brew install POW. On Linux, if any of you have played with Linux, Unix at any point, it's a little bit more tedious than that, and it doesn't do this. Figure out all that stuff. Some of the package managers on Linux do that, but this is a really neat way to not worry about configuring a tool before you install it. Homebrew does that for you. It figures out that POW needs node, downloads and installs node for you, and that is great. And you can install pretty much anything with this tool. So you'll see there's a lot of stuff. There's actually, all these guys. And you can find a lot of stuff that you'll find useful, little libraries for image manipulation, video manipulation, So keep that in mind. It's really useful. So as I said, step away from the IDE for a minute. The reason I say this to people who get started with Rails application development is that IDEs aren't bad. There's really good ones like RubyMine, for instance, that you might want to use. The problem is the bulk of the documentation and the screencasts and the courses and the things that are going to help you on the web are for these tools. So if you look for help for RubyMine, RubyMine is a good environment, and you'll find help in the RubyMine help and the tools and helpers around that. But it'll be easier if you have these tools. And there's a lot of them. So we're going to look at a few of them that I think you should know about if you're going to go ahead and start making your first app, for instance, or making something more complex than you've done before. First thing you want to do when you're on a system, I see a lot of Macs around here, there's a bunch of PCs, is to check what version of Ruby you're running. Your system version, if you're running Lion, for instance, is going to be 1.8.7. A lot of people still use 1.8.7. Many gems, many applications these days are going to use something like 1.9.2, which is a newer version, and 1.9.3, which is a newer version. Why? Because they're faster, because they have features like a different syntax, for instance, for certain things. So you want to be aware of that, and you don't want to use your system Ruby. And the reason why you don't want to do that is because if you install and create an application on 1.8.7, and then create another application and install 1.9.2, the previous application won't work anymore. It's going to have issues. And you're going to have to uninstall the entirety of Ruby and reinstall the previous version to get that first application working. That's tedious. And it gets you things like that. For instance, if you install gems, which are plugins or libraries, you're going to install Rake, and then you're going to use Rake, and you're going to see this. See this activation error over there. You've activated a newer version of Rake, and this gem file in your application is trying to use an older version of Rake, and that's going to cause you problems. So since these gem conflicts are a pain, swapping rubies are a pain, there's a tool that was created called RVM. That tool is another tool where you install something from a remote server. Again, careful. Wayne Seguin, who made RVM, is to be trusted, but don't do that for anything you see. Please check with the people that you're doing that with. That could be loading anything on your computer. In this case, it's safe, but What's neat about RVM is that instead of downloading the Ruby source code and figuring out what to do with it, you can just run this command, RVM install 193. What this command does is it's going to download, configure, and install Ruby, or the specific version of Ruby 193, for instance, for you. It's going to download it and get it ready. And once it's downloaded, you can find it by listing all the RVM Rubies that you have installed. And then you can simply say RVM use, and you're ready to use it. You're not interfering with your system version. You can start playing with Ruby 193 right away, and any other version of Ruby, maybe another interpreter, for instance, because you might not be using the default Ruby interpreter, but that's another story. You can also set Ruby 193 as your default. Let's say you're going to make applications for yourself. There's no reason for you to switch back to an older version of Ruby. You just set it as a default, and anywhere you'll go on your system, if you decide to do Rails new blah, this blah app will be running under 193. Another neat thing about RVM is the isolation it allows through gem sets. Here's basically a breakdown of what RVM does internally, so you guys can conceive of what it does if you've never seen RVM. It's going to create a container for 186, and then a bunch of gem sets are going to be filled within that container. So you'll have a global gem set that shares basically everything that you install on the global gem set you'll be able to use on any of the other gem sets you create. So let's say you make an app and you want to have a bunch of gem sets. There are gems that you're going to use, devise for authentication. You're going to use a specific version of Rails. Let's say you want to use 3.0.1. You're going to install it there, and it'll stay in that gem set, ready to be activated whenever you want. And you can swap out from this gem set to another gem set where you're using Rails 3.1, for instance. You can have another Ruby that'll have another set of gems, a global, another app, etc., etc., etc. And it's all neatly packaged away so that you can't have conflicts. And the way you create a gem set is by simply running gem set create, name, give it a name, and you can start using it. And when you use it, you'll basically have an empty environment where you can install whatever you want. So you won't have bundler, you won't have Rails, you won't have anything. You'll be able to gem install Rails from scratch, and it'll install the latest version of Rails for you. You can also do this in a very shorthand syntax where you can RVM 193 at name, basically saying, I want to install, to create a gem set under 193, and the flag create is going to do that for you. It's a little faster that way. Now the other neat thing about RVM is automating all that stuff. See, I typed a bunch of commands over there as RVM use, RVM gemset create, all that stuff. You don't have to do that. If, for instance, inside of an application, you want to automatically, whenever you go within the folder of that application with your command line, tell RVM to detect what version I declared this application should be using. Let's say it's 193. My application has a gem set. Inside of that gem set, there should be a bunch of stuff. And it should, whenever you visit that application folder, boom, you'll be in the right Ruby version, and you'll have all the gems that you set previously, whether or not you switch back and forth with an older application or a newer application. Another neat thing with RVM is that it gives you a bunch of commands like RVM current, which is going to show you the Ruby version you're currently running, the patch level, the P358 over there is the patch level. So each Ruby version gets patched periodically for fixes, bug fixes, security fixes, things like that. And then finally, what gem set you're currently running. These guys. RVM info is a bigger version, so if you want to know more, you can see the RVM version, so what version of RVM you're currently running, the Ruby version, the location of your gem set, because it's all in your system, and some more advanced information, but you shouldn't need that originally. Now, there is some hope for people who like GUIs. GUIs are graphical user interfaces. There's a neat tool called Jewelry Box. So if you don't want to do these little commands in the command line every time you want to switch a version of Ruby, for instance, Jewelry Box is a command line tool. It's a menu bar tool that's going to sit in your menu bar on the Mac. I'm sorry, I think there's a tool like that for Windows, but I'm not sure. I've never used it, so I apologize. But this is really neat. You basically click on it, you can switch to a different version of Ruby and a different gem set just as fast. And soon-ish, we should have 2 new tools that are going to make it a lot easier to get all that stuff set up. Railcar is something that Jeremy McNally is creating right now to make all those installations of scripts that I showed you for RVM, for instance, a lot faster and easier, but simply a simple wizard. Tokaido is something that Yehuda Katz is building. You may have heard of this Kickstarter project that he started, and basically trying to make it so that you can bootstrap and launch this application and set up an environment completely isolated, just like RVM does, and within minutes, so you don't have to do all these settings. Now, there's a bunch of other precision tools that I want to talk about that are beyond just setting your Rails environment. When you start a server, a Rails server, you can't have 2 servers going on at the same port. A bunch of people have these problems whenever they start using Rails. They do Rails server within an app, and then they start another app, and they get this error, address already in use. One solution is to simply specify the port on which you want to start the application. So it's going to basically open your local host, your local environment, and set it at a different address. But there's a simpler way to do that by using a tool called POW that was created by Sam Stevenson. And it allows you to basically have a bunch of servers ready to go at any time. So if you have a Twitter clone, a little Facebook clone, and your little task management app that you're working on, you can set all these apps to start whenever you hit a specific address. Let's say myapp.dev for dev. It's going to start the server for you, it's going to allow you to see the logs if you want in the background. You will never have to do something like Rails server that you've seen before. And there's a really neat tool that not enough people use to use POW. It's called Powder, and it gives you basically a simpler interface for using POW. You can gem install Powder, and once you've done that, you can Powder install, and Powder will take care of the entire installation of POW. And once you have that, you'll be able to do this command, which is whenever you're in the folder of an app, you go cd my app. You'll type in Powder link, and Powder will take care of symlinking, so making a link between your application and the POW environment, so that whenever you go to app name, if that's the name of your app, .dev, it'll start right away, like I said. And Powder Open can even allow you to just start up any browser that you have as a default with that app ready to go. There's a bunch of other commands that you can use. You can restart your server, which comes in handy a lot of the time because you want to change some configuration settings and you don't have this Rails server in the command line. It's just there. And that's really useful. App log will show you the log. So whenever you start Rails server, you'll see in your command line a list of events, logs, assets being accessed, all that stuff. App log gives you access to that. So you can directly see whatever's going on your development log right through there. And Powder list will list all the existing POW servers. So for instance, if I go to, I don't know if you guys are going to be able to see that. Jump to terminal and put it in there. If I find my mouse, whoop, there you go. So if I'm here and I do, there you go, Powder list, I can see a bunch of POW servers ready to go for a bunch of apps that I'm working on. I don't have to run servers for any of those. I can just start them. For instance, we're in the Rails for Zombie upgrades, Rails for Zombies upgrade. I can Powder open, and it's going to start my browser in the background right there. If I grab it, it's already running my app, and I can show it to you. You haven't seen it yet because it's coming. We're working on that, a new version of Rails for Zombies. There you go. Of course, they put it on the other side. So basically, yeah, my server's running right here, and if I want to observe what it's doing, I can go back here and say Powder app log, and it'll show me all the stuff that you're usually seeing with a Rails server. That's kind of neat. And back to that. So I said restart, app log, and list. Now, for debugging an application, most IDEs have a bunch of breakpoints and things that allow you to inspect what's going on with a method when it's breaking, when it's not doing what it's supposed to do. You don't exactly have that right there. So there's a bunch of tools like Debugger, and one that I specifically like called Pry. That allows you to basically set a breakpoint within your code for the execution to stop, and it will allow you to inspect what's going on within your code at that specific point in the code. So let's say we have something called class thing. It has a method called foo, and it accepts an argument set to nil by default. I put the little binding nut pry over there at the start of my function, and I try to do bar.stuff on that bar argument. The problem is that it's set to nil by default. So if I don't pass anything to foo, there's going to be a problem. And here it is. So as soon as I try to run thing.bar with no argument, I get an error. I can see that bar is nil over there, so I can't do anything with it. And then Pry will allow me to do something that looks a lot like Unix commands. If you guys have ever used Unix commands, you can ls, and you can see the methods and the variables available to you. For instance, you see the bar method right there. You can actually go within that method and inspect it. You can do that. So I showed you this guy. There's also CD, so you can spelunk within a class, within a method, to see what it's doing, what it's supposed to do. There's a bunch of more information on the Pry website for that. I urge you to look at that. If you're scared that you'll not be able to debug and know what's going on when something breaks in Rails, there's a lot of tools to help you do that, and they're pretty nice. Edit is another method that you can use whenever Pry is running. You can type in edit, and it'll open your default editor, take you right to the file. That way you can change or fix anything that you have. And when you save, you can go back in, refresh, and it'll execute with whatever you changed. Now, Bundler is something that now ships with Rails, and because of that, people take it for granted a little bit, and you shouldn't, because you really have it good if you're starting with Rails with Bundler. It used to be a lot more difficult to manage dependencies with Rails, and now we have this file, the gem file, that basically lists, this is a Rails 3.2.2 basic gem file with SQLite and a bunch of asset gems and jQuery Rails. So this is specifying what version of Uglifier I want to have, something greater than 103, and that little squiggly tilde greater than over there is something I want to talk about. So yeah, Bundler is built on the tiers of developers, and I'm not understanding that. Whenever you have to check for colliding dependencies within an application, it gets really painful, and Bundler made that a lot easier. So let's go over how you set, if let's say you want to use Devise, for instance, or you want to use Rails, you want to specify what version of Rails you want to be using it within your app. So you're going to say 3.2.2. That's specific version dependency. It's not going to try to go anywhere else whenever you try to run bundle update, for instance. It will stick to that. It will never change this version. There's another way to set your dependency by saying greater or equal to 3.2.2. So if it's 3.2.2, it's fine. If it's greater, it's fine. We'll just update. We don't really care as long as it's at least 3.2.2. That's the optimistic version constraint. And then finally, there's this squiggly guy over there, the tilde. He has another name in the documentation, but I think it's been changed. I'll skip it. You guys can figure it out. That is a loose version dependency. So what it'll do is, it's the equivalent of this. Basically saying, I need something greater than 3.2.2, what I specified, but I don't want to go to another minor version. So you see this 3.3? It will never update, if you run bundle update Rails, it will never go to 3.3, it will say at 3.2.9, for instance. And that's really useful when you don't want a gem to break your app, because most breaking changes or deprecations that happen within gems are usually on those 3.1, 3.2, 3.3. There's rarely anything that's going to break your applications and change an API or something like that within a minor bug fix 3.2 or 3.3. 3.2.3, sorry. Like I said, it's the equivalent. So these guys are equivalent. This syntax is so much better, so you might as well use that. And you'll see a lot of gem files preset with that because it's really, really convenient. You can get security fixes, bug fixes that are small and useful. And when you run these guys, so bundle install is going to look at your gem file, figure out all those specific versions you specified, and resolve all these dependencies. It's actually doing a lot of work figuring out what can work with what, and it usually is very smart, and it's really hard to break it unless you have a very complex set of gems in your gem file. That is a little more dangerous. Please don't do this unless you know what you're doing. If you haven't set specific versions for each of the gems in your gem file, this will try to update all of them. So let's say if you put devise with nothing, gem devise, it'll try to go to the highest version of devise it can find, and if you're not ready for that, knowing that devise has changed a way it handles authentication, your app will break. So don't do that unless you know what you're doing. And if you're doing it, try to make sure that you're using a specific bundle update. So bundle update Rails is okay if you want to go to the next version of Rails, but don't run this command alone. Finally, bundle exec rake. We're using rake as an example here. We'll try to use the executable for the gem within your gem file. So instead of using any rake like we saw before, remember this? there was this issue with rake db migrate because we had activated a newer version. When you type in bundle exec rake db migrate, here the bundle exec will find what version of rake is in your gem file or is available in your gemfile.log. Whatever dependency was resolved is usually logged within the gemfile.log file. And it will use that version of rake instead of your system default or your global version of rake, which will solve basically everything. And a good way to not have to type this very long thing is to alias this to BE. That way you can type BE rake and it's really quick. You have a bunch of tools, command line tools that allow you, for instance, in Z shell, if you use oh my Z shell, it will figure out whenever it needs to use bundle exec. Most of the time it will use it. It's nice to be explicit, that way you know what you're doing. So there are more tools than that. You can find amazing resources at rubytoolbox.com for basically anything. So if you don't know, you're starting with an application, or you need an authentication framework, or you don't know what to use, you should go check out this website and rubygems.com to see what's more maintained, what has been maintained over time, what's more popular. That's a good indication of whether this thing is going to be supported over time and that you can trust your app to use this gem. And finally, I would recommend you guys watching Railscasts for a specific gem. Let's say, for instance, you're not sure how to use or if you should use a specific gem. Just Google, let's say, devise Railscasts or guard Railscasts, and you'll see something. Ryan Bates does really, really good introductions that are simple enough to understand and grasp what a gem is going to do and give you as for your application. That's about it for me. You can come talk to me if you have questions. I don't bite. I like beginners because they remind me of how Rails should help beginners, not dumb itself down, but we can always help people get on board, and that's what I like to do. So feel free to come see me and talk to me. You can also find me on Twitter right there. Thank you very much.